The Crusades. How did it happen? So a little bit of a background on the Crusades. Okay, so we're gonna go to the concept of a crusade, what a crusade is, the peace and truce of God, the monastery at Cluny and Cluniacs, and the role of lay investiture. Now, the concept of a crusade is that it was penance. It was knights seeking forgiveness for their sins by going to the holiest city in Christendom, Jerusalem, and taking it from the Muslims. It's important to remember that this was more than just a military mission. This was a, lack of a better term, military pilgrimage. It was a religious journey with a military emphasis. So how does the church come around to the idea that they can declare such a massive military intervention? Well, St. Augustine and a concept of just war, one of the earlier Christian thinkers, he comes up with the concept of a church-approved war. The idea is that war should not be offensive, but rather in the defense of innocence. And if you come to the aid of the innocents, then war is justified. And in Augustine's mind, the innocents, of course, would be the church and fellow Christians. And the idea in Western Europe was that Christianity was under attack. So, the power of the church, the peace and truce of God, the peace in God and the truce of God, two separate things. It was a movement by the church to regulate war. It begins around the Treaty of Verdun in 843 when disorder falls upon Charlemagne's now gone empire. If you recall, the Treaty of Verdun in 843 split up Charlemagne's empire into three distinct regions amongst his grandsons. You have a breaking down of order once again, and the church tries to bring some order through the meetings of warring nobles. So what would happen? Well, beginning around the 9th century, local bishops would order warring nobles to come to a meeting. And if the bishops could convince the nobles to come through threat or through bribery, the church would gather up all sorts of relics in the region, bones, blood, and the warlords would take an oath, a sacred oath on the relics. And remember, we cannot overemphasize the importance of relics and the oath over relic to the medieval mind. The peace of God starts in around the 9th century. It grants immunity, which means no harm can come to them, to non-combatants, civilians. It starts with peasants and clergy, but soon it's extended to children and the defenseless. And again, where does the power come from to the church to enforce this? Well, nobles who don't follow along are excommunicated. Excommunication, of course, means to be kicked out of the church. In order to go to heaven, which was a very real place, and to avoid hell, which was a very real place to the medieval Christian, you needed to be part of the church. Excommunication from that church would most assuredly assure the doomed soul. Truce of God. Now, where the peace of God prevented violence against the church, the poor, the truce of God focused on violence between Christians, specifically knights, the warrior class. It was first proclaimed in 1027, and in the beginning it was simply an initial ban on fighting on Sundays and the holy days. Eventually it's extended to include all of Lent and Friday of every week. The key point here is now with the truce of God, the church is trying to regulate fighting amongst Christians. The monastery at Cluny, founded in 910, it was supported by a strong church, and it was free from any control from the secular authorities, meaning the king or the queen. It only answered to the Pope. The monastery at Cluny supported the reforms of Gregory VII, particularly the church's position on lay investiture. They strongly supported the truce of God, which obviously strengthened the role of the Catholic Church, and it produced 4 popes, including Gregory VII and Urban II. So how does the church gain the authority to call for a crusade? Well, let's bring in a little arithmetic, shall we? You have the concept of a just war put forth by St. Augustine. You have the church using its political and spiritual authority with the peace and truce of God, and enter the monastery at Cluny with the really cool name of the members, Cluniacs. Add these together and you have the church can call for a crusade. Well, that concludes this tutorial on the background to the Crusades.
That's all, folks.